Hey guys, Matt Jumper here. I put out a site for my friends at Simple Things last week, and I built the site on Framer, which means I didn't use any code to make it. I got a lot of people on Twitter asking for a tutorial on how to do this cool archway animation. So I stripped it out of the site, and not only am I going to show you how to make it for yourself, but I'm also going to give you the remix link for free. I do have a full Framer template based on the Simple Things site that is going to drop hopefully this week. So follow me on Twitter for updates on that. But once it's available, I'll make sure that I put the link in this description. And this is my first video, so please be kind. Likes, comments, subscriptions, all that stuff is pretty much the only indicator that I have to keep making these videos. So if you find them helpful, please let me know. So yeah, let's get into it. Before we get into Framer, we're just going to use Figma real quick to make that archway mask and then bring it in Framer and finish the rest there. So we're just going to create a frame that's 1,000 pixels wide and 3,000 pixels tall. It's that big just to deal with the overflow. We're going to remove the fill from the background, and then we're just going to rename the frame arch. And then inside this, we're going to create a rectangle at the same size, and then just align it vertically and horizontally. And then we're just going to click on the layer and hit Command D to duplicate it. And then we're going to rename them arch on the top and then BG for the background in the back. I'm going to set the fill on the background to the wall color that I want. And then on the top layer in the arch, I'm actually just going to detach the radiuses or radii and then set the top left and right to 800. Then I'm going to duplicate the arch and rename it to mask. Then back to the arch, kill the fill, add a stroke to the inside. It's going to be 40 pixels. You can change it from a solid fill into a linear gradient, and we're just going to change it from vertical to horizontal. So just going to drag those 2 points kind of near the top. And then the left side, you're going to be going a bit darker than your wall color because it's your shadow. Then on the right side, you're going to be a bit lighter than the wall color because it's your highlights. And then make sure the opacity is set to 100%, because by default it's at 0. Cool, so now we're going to grab the arch and just set it to 30-40 for the height, so that way the bottom base is just cut off. We don't have to deal with that. Select the mask and the BG, and then go to Figma's version of the Pathfinder up there. Click on the right icon and hit subtract selection. So then now all that's left in the background is that outside space of the wall. So now we can just grab the arch frame and export a PNG, and then we're going to hop over to Framer. Okay, so we're going to start by selecting the desktop frame and just turning it into a stack by hitting the plus button beside the layout, and just make sure that gap is set to 0. And then just going to Command V and paste in the arch image. We're going to set the width to 100% relative, and then just make sure that that aspect ratio is kept locked. Then we're going to add a stack to the arch layer, and we're going to be using this shortcut a lot, so keep that in mind. We're just going to set the width and the height to fill, and the gap to 0, and align that to the top. And there we go, creating another stack on top of this, and we're going to rename this one Hero. We're going to set the height of this to 100 VH, which is 100% of the viewport. Align that to the top. The gap's going to be set to 0, and then just a quick rename of the arch stack, call that middle, because we're going to create the 2 sides around this as well to complete the wall. Duplicate the stack, kill the layer inside, name it left. We're going to set the width to 0.5 fill, and then we're going to set the color to the wall color that we set in Figma. I have it as a color token so that if I need to change the wall color later, it will update everywhere, which realistically I probably will, like I've done. And then duplicate the left, move it to the bottom, and call it right. And then now we have a nice wall. So we're going to add this to a stack and take away those gaps, get the holes out, rename it to main, and then we're going to set the width and the height to fill. And we're going to set the alignment to the top. Cool, so the wall is starting to take shape, but we're going to have our navigation in here later. So we want to keep some space at the top. So we're going to duplicate the left stack, bring it outside of that main stack above, rename it top, and then we can grab those two stacks, create another stack out of them, aim at wall. Let's take that width and height, set it to fill, direction, set it up and down so it stays at the top, set the gap to 0, and then take that width and set it to 1 fill. So the height, we can match it to our navigation, which I've set to 112 pixels. You can't actually notice it here, but what I've noticed sometimes when I scroll through this hero is that since the different stacks in the wall are technically separate, they're just like touching each other, but not overlapping. So there is like some black lines that occasionally show up, just like a kind of a rendering issue. So just to solve this in a very kind of hacky way without using any code, we're just going to set the scale of these three elements to 1.01. Since there is no just like simple transform without animation, we're just going to set a scroll transform, but the from and the to values are just going to be the same thing. So there's not going to be animation, but it's constantly just going to be a bit bigger so that overlap is there. So now we can duplicate that empty stack, which is top, and then bring it outside of that wall, still inside the hero. And now we're going to make our image. So let's name this stack the image container. We want this taking up the whole screen and being independent of the wall. So we can set the type to absolute and the width and height to relative at 100%. And just make sure that it's horizontally and vertically aligned here. And since it's behind the wall, we want to set the Z index to 1, make sure that that's set. So it's behind, and then the wall, we want to add a Z index, which it doesn't currently have. Set that to 2. So now you can see the arch is above the image container, but the image container currently has a fill of the wall. So let's just set this to like a black or off black color, just so when you have the image, if you want to reduce the opacity, you can do that. So we can duplicate that image container stack and call it image and just keep it inside the parent. We can set the type to relative. We can just set it to 100% width and height. And then we're going to take the fill and drop in our image here. Beautiful. Just going to grab the image and drag the opacity down to say 0.75. Grab those two stacks, add another stack, and we can call this background. And again, just setting that width and height to fill within that hero container. And the gap's always at 0. Cool, so we have our image, we have our arch. So now it's time for some content on top of the hero. So now we can just duplicate that background and delete all of the content inside, rename it to content, and we can set the position to absolute. And then same thing, we just want to set the width and the height to 100%, so it takes up the full screen. Then we can set the Z index to 3, so it's above your background. I'm going to set the gap to 8 for the spacing just in between the text. I'm going to add a bit of padding as well. I'm setting it to 40 pixels all around, plus an additional 40 pixels on top, so 80, just to offset the arch a little bit and visually have it centered. So you can select the text tool and then just get writing and style it as you please. I'm just going to select my preset styles here. So depending on your content length and how big you make your arch, you may want to play with the max widths on the stacks. Just make sure your text is set to fill so it plays nicely on smaller screens and doesn't get cut off. So the hero looks good, but you're probably wondering how we're going to make this thing actually animate on scroll. And we're going to do that basically by using scroll sections to trigger different variants and animations. So we're going to duplicate the hero stack and then just remove all of its contents. And then we can click on the desktop stack and just set the height to fit, so then it's vertically responsive to all the content. You'll notice that both the heroes are set to 100 VH, and we're going to keep it like that. And it's important that these are actually both the same size, because the second hero here is actually going to be mimicking the first hero as far as the height goes. but we're just going to put some trigger points inside. So we can rename the stack to hero scroll 1. You can duplicate it, put inside, and you can rename it nav buffer 1. So the buffer is going to be the space between the top of the browser and the first trigger point. So we're going to set this to 8 pixels, which essentially means that as soon as the user scrolls 8 pixels, then that navigation is going to change to that smaller state. So that's the buffer, and we duplicate this, and we can call this nav trigger 1. And we're also going to set the scroll section to the same name. So this is a trigger that we're going to point to for that navigation to actually change. So now you can duplicate the buffer and the trigger and then just reorder them. So it's buffer, trigger, and rename them to 2. And then on the scroll section, we're going to update that number as well. We can keep them all at 8 pixels except for the second buffer, which is the space between the navigation becoming small and white with the blur background. And then you can grab the hero scroll stack and just make sure that the direction is set to up and down. So we want to set the hero to fixed. So this is going to be stationary while the fake hero with all the triggers scroll on top of it, but you won't be able to see any of that. So it's not super obvious kind of looking at it visually, but basically since this hero is fixed, all of the content underneath it is really starting at 0 at the top of the browser, which is how all of this magic works. And then we want to set the width to 100% relative. Anytime you set a stack or layer to fixed, it's going to change that width. If you had it from relative or fill, it's going to go to width. So just make sure that you go back and fix that. So now we can duplicate the hero scroll stack, rename it, and delete all the contents in it. And essentially this second hero scroll is going to be just a scroll buffer. So during the animation, we just want essentially 2 screen sizes or 2 screen heights before the body comes in. So we're going to keep that at 100 VH. We can duplicate this stack again and call it body. And we're just going to set some scroll sections here. So the hero scroll 1. And then the body, same thing. So for the body, typically you'd actually have the height set to fit, but since I don't have a lot of content here, I'm just going to keep it at 100 VH. I'm just going to drop in my pre-made content here and set the width to fill. And then let's set the Z index to 4, so it shows on top of the hero, and then make sure it has a background. So let's just make this white. Okay, so let's check in on the preview and just see how this looks. So the top of the arch is getting a bit cut off, and the background image just isn't reaching the bottom there. So these should be quick fixes. Let's just jump back to the arch, the middle, set the overflow to visible, and then just for safe measure, we can just jump the Z index up to 9. And then we can just do the same thing on the main stack here as well. So it's looking better. We just got to fix the image. So like I said before, if you play with the parameters of stacks, whether that be changing the type, between absolute and relative, or changing the width to between like relative and fixed, it can kind of break the width and height parameters of its children. It looks like that's what happened here. So we're just going to set the height and width back to 100%, and this should do it. And we're good. So for the navigation, I already have my nav set up, so I'm just going to drop it in here. And then we're just going to go to the layers panel and drag it above the other layers. We're going to set the position to fixed and align it to the top. We're going to make sure that it's horizontally centered. And to set the width to 100% being relative instead of fixed. I'm just going to bring the Z index to 9 so it always stays at the very top. And then I'm just going to make sure that the default variant here is the color that I want. I'm not going to walk you through the entire creation of the navigation because that would just take another hour, but just a quick overview of how I have this set up. So you'll see it's a bit of a matrix. The top is just the 3 breakpoints, desktop, tablet, phone. The only difference there is really just the outside padding. So in desktop, it's like 40 pixels. left and right, tablet's 32, phone is down to 16, and then on phone, I just turn the YouTube button into an icon. But on the left, you'll see that we have the landing and the scroll states. So the landing state is just, everything's just a bit bigger, and the height is set to 112. And then the scroll states, that height shrinks, and then all the elements kind of shrink a bit. And the backgrounds are also blurred. So I'm doing this using the BG blur, which by default isn't visible, and so you just got to go to View and make sure that Show Background Blur is checked off. I have the value set to 24, and then the other important thing here is on the dark state, I have a bit of a fill. It's like an off-white, and it's set to 16%. And then on the dark, or on the light version, I have it to black at 4%. This is just to soften the blur a bit, as well as just make sure that things actually stay legible. And then you'll notice there's a last state of the scroll state without the blur. So I'm doing this on basically like in the hero, when you first scroll, I don't want the blur background because it creates actually like a background and a separation line. I just want that to be seamless until you get to the image, then you get the white version with the background blur. And you'll notice on the landing state as well, there's no blur, just so everything is super clean. So back to the home screen and make sure these variants change based on your scroll position connected to those scroll sections that we set up. So the main variant is your starting state, which is the desktop landing dark. So to add these variants, we're going to go to Effects, hit the plus button, and hit Add Scroll Variants. So the trigger should be Section and View, and then Start is always going to be the anchor to the top. Replay is set to Yes, and then we're going to set the first one to Nav Trigger 1, and we're going to go Desktop Scroll Dark with no blur. And then the second one, we're going to do Nav Trigger 2, and it's going to be Desktop Scroll Light. And then third one is when we get to the body, we want that to go back to dark, but with the blur. And then click off. Once we preview this, we can see the animation is happening, the navigation. You don't really get the full context yet without the arch animating, so you don't know how soon that white animation needs to happen, for example. So once we get the arch animation, we can revisit this and make sure that everything's happening when we want it to. So now we can set the animations for the hero itself. So for the wall, basically what we want is to go from this current state pretty much into just a giant zoom to reveal the entire image behind it. So we're going to just select the wall stack. So we're going to go to Effects, Add, Scroll Transform, Section and View. Again, we're going to set to Hero Scroll 1. Again, make sure the viewport's set to the top. And then From, we're just going to set this to 1, 1, the default state. And then 2, we're going to set this to just the scale is going to be 4. So that should pretty much get rid of that archway and just reveal the full image. And then just quick transition, add a nice spring to it. And then we're going to do the image. So for the image, we want to do just a subtle zoom, just because we're already revealing more of the image as the mask lifts. And a little zoom goes a long way here, because if you go too much, you're just going to get, you're going to lose a lot of the image. So we want to grab the image container stack, and then same thing, just go to the effects, add a scroll transform. We want to set it to section and view, hero scroll 1. Just quickly add that transition. From, we're just going to set this again to 1 and 1. And then 2, we just want the scale to go up just a bit, so 1.05 should do the trick. So for the content, we're going to add another scroll transform. Section in view, we're going to set the section to hero scroll 1, viewport top, and then from, we're going to set it to actually opacity 1. Within the scale, we're going to set it to 0.9, so it's a bit smaller than full scale. And then the offset, we're going to set to 20. And then 2, the scale, we're just going to do 1.1. So just like slightly a bit smaller, going to slightly a bit bigger, and then the offset, we're going to go to -80, just zooming in and going up a bit. And we're going to add that transition as well. So it'd be cool for the content to slide in from the bottom just on the page load, but because of the scroll transform Y offset, it kind of conflicts with just like a simple appear animation in Framer. So we're going to do it a bit differently. I'm just going to use a scroll animation, and we're going to keep the trigger to layer in view, and then we're going to set the preset to slide in bottom. You can detach the enter and exit and just remove the exit. And then enter effects, the opacity of 0 is fine, and then the Y offset is just set to 180. And then that should pretty much just replace the appear animation. So if you hit play, everything is looking pretty slick. If you run into any issues with the triggers not happening when you expect them to, just jump to the hero scroll stack and go to the distribute drop down and just make sure it's at start. That means it'll actually align it to the top instead of the middle. That might be the issue. And then I'm also going to go to the nav buffer 2 and just take that down from 400 to 300 so it's happening a bit sooner. Beautiful. Okay, now to make it responsive. It's not going to take too long. We're just going to set a tablet breakpoint. We're actually going to bring it down to 648 just because it's quick maths. So grab the middle stack and we're just going to set those to fixed at 600. And we're going to grab the left and right fills and set them to 1. So we're just going to take up all the space outside of that 600. And then the phone, I'm going to grab that middle one again and set this to fill. So it's going to take up all the space it can, but then the left and right, we're going to set it fixed and just 24 width. So now if we hit play, the way that this responds is pretty fluid and seamless. And then basically for the navigation, we just need to go through and set these variants and do the tedious work of setting it to essentially the same thing, but tablet just needs all the tablet variants and phone needs all the phone variants. So I'm just going to fast forward all this. I guess slow it down if you need to see it, but also check the remix link to actually just play around with it. So desktop's looking good. And then if you drag in the browser, sometimes you just need a quick refresh for it to load the mobile variant, and you'll see it is looking good too. Cool, so that's it. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Hopefully you learned something. If you did, comment, like, subscribe, follow on Twitter, whatever, all that stuff that people do. But yeah, have a good night, have a good day. I don't know what's going on. I need to go to bed. Bye.